Okay, let's tell them about the history of the U.S. dollar, because this is going to start tying all this in. What's going on with this dollar destruction policy?
Yeah, it's an interesting story, Alan, and I think it would be a good idea to talk through the history of the dollar, because understanding where we've come from in our nation's history and where we've come from in terms of what the U.S. dollar is very important to understanding our current situation. In my opinion, the U.S. dollar is the subject of the greatest counterfeiting scheme in the history of the world. And what I mean by that is most everybody associates the word dollar as referring to those green pieces of paper with presidents' faces on it, the Federal Reserve notes. But those are Federal Reserve notes. They are not the same thing as dollars. And I think that confusing these terms is a dangerous mistake that is ultimately going to lead to the downfall of our economy. Now, a pound, if you think about what a pound is, Alan, it refers to 16 ounces of weight. A foot refers to 12 ounces of length. These are standards of measure. But the word dollar refers to a specific coin of a specific mass, namely one containing 371 grains of pure silver. This is the definition of a dollar. This is what a dollar is. It is a standard of weight, and then the term came from Spanish milled coins. Now, a dollar is not merely worth some ever-changing quantity of gold or silver. The word dollar is specifically defined as an amount of silver, the same way a foot is defined as 12 inches. Now, President George Washington signed in the Coinage Act of 1792, establishing the dollar, this amount of silver, as the monetary unit of the United States of America. In the act itself, you can look it up. It says the dollar, meaning, quote, a coin containing 371 grains of pure silver, is going to be the unit of currency for the United States. Now, how do we go from a dollar of silver to the Federal Reserve notes made of these pieces of paper that are now literally not backed by anything except good faith in the economy? Well, it started out in that same act, in the Currency Act of 1792, that Congress artificially pegged a ratio of gold to silver. Now, I'm not exactly sure why they did this. I'm sure it had political reasons, but what this did is it threw an imbalance in the market between gold and silver.
And that's what they call the silver ratio.
Exactly. The silver to gold ratio. It's historically been between 14 and 16 to 1 in terms of gold. But
16 to 1's the number I always hear.
Yep. But there are certain times where one or the other might be over or undervalued in the market compared to a pegged ratio. It's the same thing if you think about price fixes and rent control and things like that. Anytime you artificially set a price, set a ratio of exchange, you might have market imbalances. So that's what we saw. We saw government interference in the market to artificially peg one commodity against the other. And what we saw was silver disappearing from circulation. This kind of set the grounds for this artificial gold, de facto gold standard, basically. So the first step really in the transition from a silver dollar towards the paper U.S. dollar was this crowding out of silver in the market. For the next 65 years or so, the government, the United States, found itself still trading gold, still trading silver freely on the market. And we also, I think it's very interesting, there were a lot of foreign coins, foreign gold and silver coins that were regularly exchanged on the market, because if you think if a coin is a certain weight made of a certain metal, then it's just as good as any other coin. But if there's one thing that our government hates, and most government hates, that's competition. So in 1857, Congress outlawed the use of foreign coins in exchange on the U.S. market. The next giant step in transitioning from a silver dollar to the paper money that we have today was Abraham Lincoln's need to fund his invasion of the South. Now, you can't just create real money and real wealth out of thin air. You can't do that when you're stuck with a gold and silver standard. So in 1862, President Lincoln gave the U.S. government the power to print up paper money he called greenbacks. So
U.S. notes.
They were U.S. notes, and basically the United States went off the gold standard in order to finance the war against Southern independence. Now, in 1873 and later in 1900, the United States officially replaced silver with the gold as the official U.S. currency, putting us on a gold standard, what's called the classical gold standard, where we remained until 1933. But in 1934, Franklin Delano Roosevelt again needed money to fund his progressive socialist programs that were from the New Deal and other programs that he had concocted. So he scrapped the gold standard entirely for the United States. And Alan, you mentioned it yesterday, he actually had an executive order that made it illegal for United States citizens, private citizens, to hold gold. They all had to exchange it into the Federal Reserve and exchange it for these Federal Reserve notes.
Yeah, not only to hold gold, but also to hold gold certificates.
So prior to 1934, with this executive order, if you got a Federal Reserve note, one of the green pieces of paper, on that note, it actually said redeemable in gold on demand at the United States Treasury or the Federal Reserve. So you could actually go to the Federal Reserve and trade your greenback or your Federal Reserve note for gold, for real gold. But that was done away with in 1934. And starting in 1963, the words on the Federal Reserve notes, on those green pieces of paper we trade around, the words, "we will pay to the bearer on demand," no longer appeared at all. So now each Federal Reserve note merely specified a number. So it says $20 on there, but that was no longer redeemable for $20 of silver or $20 in the amount of gold at the exchange rate at the time. Finally, with the U.S. mounting its debt problems and gold flowing out of the country during the 1960s and early 1970s.
In response to LBJ's Great Society.
Right. Anytime you see more increases in government spending that aren't funded by taxes or debt, they're funded through inflation. So the Federal Reserve was printing a lot of money. But at that time, foreign investors and foreign banks were still able to exchange their dollars for gold at Fort Knox. And we saw a lot of gold flowing out of the country. And we got to the point where President Nixon realized that our country was literally bankrupt, that it could not honor these obligations. So with the Smithsonian Agreement in 1971, he cut off the ties of the U.S. dollar to any commodity, gold or silver.
He being Richard Nixon.
Right. Richard Nixon repealed the gold standard, refused to honor U.S. debts that were backed by gold. Now today, the green pieces of paper you hold were at one time redeemable for a set amount of gold, or at one time redeemable for a set amount of silver. That would be 371 grains of pure silver. And since the inception of the Federal Reserve, and this is very important to note, and I wish everybody in the country could really fully understand this and let it sink in. Since the inception of the Federal Reserve in 1913, they have destroyed over 95% of the purchasing power of your money, and it is currently on pace to destroy our monetary system itself. But I wanted to leave everybody today with a thought from the mouth of John Maynard Keynes. He's an open supporter of socialism, and Keynes noted in his book titled The Economic Consequences of the Peace that the best way to destroy the capitalist system was to debauch the currency, and that's what we've seen with the U.S. dollar. He went on to say, by continuing a process of inflation, governments can confiscate secretly and unobserved an important part of the wealth of their citizens. There is no subtler, no surer means of overturning the existing basis of society than to debauch the currency. The process engages all the hidden forces of economic law on the side of destruction and does it in a manner which not one man in a million is able to diagnose. That pretty much sums up our current situation, Alan.
Jason, there's two other things that I would like to point out when going back to the silver ratio. To maintain the historic silver ratio, silver has really begun to take off, and I think it will eventually catch up to the proper silver ratio. Secondly, you had mentioned that time period, what was it, when we left the silver standard in favor of the gold standard around the 1890s.
Right.
It's interesting to note that The Wizard of Oz was actually about that flight from silver to a gold standard. Now, a lot of people know The Wizard of Oz is a children's kind of fairy tale, but it was actually a book about the monetary system at the time. It was written shortly after we left the silver standard in favor of the gold standard. And in the book, The Wizard of Oz, you remember the dangerous yellow brick road. That was a gold money only money standard. And in the book, Dorothy's slippers were silver. In the movie, they were ruby because
that was the first movie where they used the Technicolor. They wanted to show off their special effects. So they had those ruby red slippers flashing.
Yes, but so for the purposes of the movie, they went to the ruby because it showed up better in color than silver. But that whole book is actually about the monetary system and the conversion from a silver standard to a gold standard. Our founding fathers favored the silver standard because gold is in such greater limited supply. It was easy for the money trust, the banksters, to control gold than it was silver. And the money trust was behind the banksters, were behind this conversion to a gold standard. So the guy wrote The Wizard of Oz. Dorothy travels in the book, travels the yellow brick road, that dangerous yellow brick road, wearing silver slippers. That's the way she could navigate the dangerous yellow brick road. There's a lot of other symbolism in that book. For example, the Wicked Witch of the East, those were the banksters. The Wicked Witch of the West, those were the railroads. Dorothy represented the common everyday person, and she could always get back home if she clapped her silver slippers. The Tin Man was the industry that had been frozen up by this. There was a calling of all the notes done by the banksters, and they froze up the liquidity. They intentionally drove the economy into a depression, and from a lack of liquidity, because they called all the notes. So that's what the Tin Man was all about. And that liquidity he needed, that oil, is how he was able to keep going. The lion was William Jennings Bryan, because during that debate, during that conversion to a gold-only standard, William Jennings Bryan was the big advocate for maintaining a silver standard, but he flipped at the end. The flying monkeys were the Asians that worked for the railroad. So we all know it is a fairy tale, but it is interesting to note it is actually a book about the monetary system and the debates that were going on at that time.
Alan, that's really interesting that such a movie that is ingrained in the American culture has so much symbolism that people have watched, I'm sure, dozens of times and really don't have any idea about the origins, about what a lot of those symbols mean. It's incredible. One thing that I wanted to point out as well, we were talking about the Founding Fathers and how they envisioned a silver standard or a gold standard. I think that in itself created a little bit of conflict in our monetary system. When you're looking at an economy, when you're looking at the marketplace, government doesn't need to create any type of monetary standard. If you have people freely trading gold and silver on the markets, you can even have people privately minting coins, as George Selden has shown in his book, Good Money, that they did in Scotland and other places throughout history. And it's worked incredibly well, and it's led to stable financial systems. It's led to stable currencies. And the market regulations that are put in place actually do a better job at regulating that than these government regulations of forcing a standard.
And we'll see on the other side of this break.